The summer I turned 13, I learned that monsters don't always hide under beds. Sometimes they sit at the dinner table carving Sunday roast with steady hands, asking you to pass the salt. Sometimes they tuck you in at night with the same fingers that will later steal your childhood piece by piece, in the suffocating darkness of a Kansas farmhouse. My name is Anna Wheeler, and this is the story of how I discovered that the devil can wear a grandfather's face, and that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who will destroy you without hesitation. Cedar Ridge, Kansas, in 1955, was the kind of place where secrets grew heavy in the summer heat, where whispered conversations died when children entered rooms, and where the truth had a way of hiding itself in the spaces between what people said and what they meant. Our farmhouse sat like a weathered gravestone on the prairie, its white paint peeling in long strips that curled and fell to the ground like shed skin. I remember the exact moment everything changed, July 15th, 1955, at 3:17 in the afternoon. I know the time because the grandfather clock in the hallway had just finished its mournful chimes when I found myself alone in Mama's room, surrounded by the ghost of her lavender perfume and the terrible silence she'd left behind. She'd been gone 3 months by then. Cancer, they said. But 3 months felt like 3 years when you're 13 and suddenly living with the man who'd raised your mother, the man whose eyes followed you in ways that made your skin crawl, whose compliments felt like warnings wrapped in honey. Samuel Wheeler was 72 years old with silver hair that caught the light like spun metal and hands that had built half the barns in Cedar Ridge County. To everyone else, he was a pillar of the community, a deacon at First Baptist, a man who never missed a church social, who brought apple pie to grieving families, and read scripture with the kind of authority that came from believing every word. To me, he was becoming something else entirely. The violations had started small after my parents died 8 years ago, a hand that lingered too long on my shoulder fingers that traced my spine when he said goodnight comments about how I was growing into a woman, that made my stomach twist with something I couldn't yet name. But each day brought new boundary crossings. Each night brought him closer to my bedroom door, and each morning brought the crushing realization that there was nowhere to run in a town where Samuel Wheeler's word was gospel. Cedar Ridge had exactly 1047 people, most of them farmers or folks who worked at businesses serving the farming families scattered across our county. Main Street stretched for exactly 4 blocks and consisted of Paulson's General Store with its creaky wooden floors and glass penny candy jars, Murphy's Diner, where farmers gathered every morning for coffee and gossip about weather and crop prices, the First National Bank with its imposing limestone facade, Thompson's Hardware that smelled of motor oil and metal, and Miller's Pharmacy, where old Mrs. Miller dispensed aspirin and medical advice with equal confidence. The Baptist church stood at the end of Main Street like a white-painted guardian, its tall steeple reaching higher than any other building for miles around. Every Sunday morning, that church filled with families dressed in their finest clothes, listening to Pastor Williams preach about Christian values, family duty, and the absolute importance of respecting your elders and keeping family matters private. In this environment, Samuel Wheeler was more than just respected, he was revered. When he spoke at church services or town meetings, people leaned forward to catch every word. When he offered advice about farming techniques or family matters, they usually followed his suggestions without question. The idea that such a man could be capable of the horrors I experienced in his house would have seemed not just impossible, but blasphemous to the good people of Cedar Ridge. That afternoon, while he was in town conducting business at the grain elevator, I found myself standing in Mama's room, desperate for any trace of her presence, any whisper of the woman who might have protected me if she'd lived. Her dresser drawers had been cleared out weeks ago. Samuel's doing, he said, to help me move forward, but I'd always wondered about the small wooden box she kept hidden behind her jewelry case. My hands shook as I reached for it, this last secret corner of my mother's life. The box was heavier than I'd expected, made of dark wood, with tiny brass hinges that protested with age. Inside, beneath a layer of tissue paper that crackled like dry leaves, I found a collection of items that made no immediate sense: photographs of women I didn't recognize, newspaper clippings with headlines about missing persons, and a leather journal bound with a faded ribbon. The photographs were what caught my attention first. Young women, most of them barely out of childhood, with hollow eyes and forced smiles. Written on the backs in my mother's careful script were names and dates: Rebecca, 1943, Sarah, 1944, Elizabeth, 1946. The years meant nothing to me then, but the expression in their eyes, that particular kind of fear that tries to disguise itself as compliance, was disturbingly familiar. I opened the journal with trembling fingers, and my mother's handwriting spilled across the page like bloodstains. I can't let this continue. I can't let him do to Anna what he did to me, what he did to those other girls. People need to know what Samuel Wheeler really is, but the corruption runs deeper than anyone realizes. Sheriff Morrison takes money to look the other way. Judge Henley dismisses cases before they can go to trial. Pastor Williams preaches about family privacy while knowing exactly what that privacy conceals. They've created a system where monsters are protected and victims are silenced. The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat down hard on Mama's bed, the journal clutched against my chest, my heart hammering so loud. I was certain Samuel would hear it from town. What he did to me. The phrase echoed in my mind, reshaping everything I thought I knew about my family, my mother, my life. My own mother had been Samuel's victim, had endured the same violations, the same systematic destruction of innocence that I was experiencing now. I forced myself to keep reading, even as my hands shook so violently I could barely hold the pages steady. The network is bigger than anyone realizes. Samuel has connections throughout Kansas and beyond, men in power who protect him, who participate, who help move girls from family to family like cattle. They've been operating for decades, generating enormous profits while destroying countless lives. Sheriff Morrison is bought and paid for. Judge Henley, too. Even some of the church board members are involved. They've created a system where accusations against Samuel are dismissed as the fantasies of troubled children or vengeful adults. Page after page revealed the scope of the horror I'd stumbled into. My mother had spent months documenting a trafficking network that stretched across multiple counties, involving dozens of respected community members who used their positions to facilitate and cover up systematic child abuse. I found the financial records today hidden in Samuel's private safe. Detailed accounts of every child sold through the network, including purchase prices, delivery schedules, and buyer preferences. The amounts are staggering. Some children bring in thousands of dollars, depending on their age, appearance, and the specific services they're being purchased to provide. Anna is already listed in his future inventory, marked for premium placement, when she reaches 14. The clinical language made my stomach turn. I wasn't just Samuel's granddaughter. I was merchandise being prepared for market. My value calculated based on factors that reduced me to nothing more than a commodity. But buried within the horror was a thread of hope that made my heart race with possibility. Agent Harrison from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation has been working with me to gather evidence. The local authorities can't be trusted, but the state police have integrity and the power to prosecute across county lines. We've been building a case for months, documenting the network's operations and gathering testimony from survivors willing to come forward. If something happens to me before we can complete the prosecution, Anna should know that Agent Harrison will still be working to bring justice. The evidence is hidden in multiple locations, and there are people outside Cedar Ridge who know the truth and are committed to stopping Samuel's operation. Agent Harrison, a real law enforcement officer who couldn't be bought, who had been working with my mother to expose the network. Someone outside Cedar Ridge who might actually listen, who might actually help. I flipped through more pages, finding detailed notes about other families involved in the trafficking operation. The Hendersons in Topeka, specialists in training young women for specific purposes. The Carlsons in Junction City, who ran what appeared to be a legitimate boarding school. but actually served as a distribution center for children being sold to buyers in distant cities. The Martins in Kansas City, whose adoption agency was really a front for matching children with predators who paid premium prices for specific physical characteristics. The scope of this operation is staggering. They've been doing this for over 20 years, moving hundreds of children through their network, generating millions of dollars in profits, while destroying entire families. And they've been protected by a web of corruption that extends from local law enforcement all the way to state government officials, who benefit financially from keeping the operation running smoothly. But the entry that stopped my heart cold was near the end of the journal. I discovered the truth about Robert today. I found his private records, the ones he thought he'd hidden so carefully in the false bottom of his desk drawer. My own husband has been keeping detailed accounts of every child sold through Samuel's network, including financial transactions, delivery schedules, and buyer feedback. Robert isn't another victim, he's Samuel's full partner, his right-hand man in the trafficking operation. They've been working together since before Anna was born, and she's already been promised to buyers who are waiting for her to reach the right age. The journal fell from my hands as the terrible truth crashed over me like ice water. My father, the man I'd mourned as Samuel's victim, the loving parent I'd imagined trying to protect me, had been planning to sell me like merchandise. I confronted Robert about the records, and he didn't even try to deny it. He told me that Samuel taught him the business when he was just 18 years old, that they'd been partners for over 15 years. He said Anna was always meant to be part of the inventory, that they'd been grooming her since birth for this purpose. When I threatened to expose them both, Robert made it clear that he would choose the operation over his family. "You can't stop something this big," he said. "Too many important people depend on the money we generate. If you try to bring us down, you'll just disappear like all the other troublemakers who got too curious." The final entries were dated just days before my parents' fatal car accident. "I'm leaving with Anna tomorrow night, whether Robert agrees to come with us or not. I have copies of all the evidence hidden in 3 different locations, where Anna can find them if something happens to me. Agent Harrison is expecting us at the state police barracks on Friday morning. We're going to expose the entire network no matter what it costs. I would rather die fighting than let them destroy my daughter's life the way they destroyed mine." Robert found out about my plans. He's furious, says I'm going to get us all killed for nothing. But I won't change my mind. Anna deserves better than this. All those children deserve justice. If we don't fight back, the network will keep destroying lives for another 20 years. Tomorrow night we run. Tomorrow night we begin the fight to save Anna and stop Samuel Wheeler forever. The entry was dated April 14, 1947, one day before the car accident that killed both my parents and delivered me straight back into Samuel's hands. I heard Samuel's truck turning into the driveway, the familiar rumble of the engine that always made my stomach clench with dread. But this time, the fear was different, more complex. This time, I understood that I wasn't just fighting one monster. I was fighting an entire network of them, including the memory of a father who had betrayed me, before I was even old enough to understand what betrayal meant. Quickly, I gathered the most damning evidence and tucked it into my dress pocket. The rest, I returned to the box, shoving it back behind the jewelry case where I'd found it. But I also found something else hidden beneath the journal, a small silver locket that I remembered my mother wearing, the one Samuel had claimed was lost in the accident. The locket was warm to the touch, as if it had been waiting for me all these years. Inside was a tiny photograph of 3 women, my mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother, standing together with expressions of fierce determination. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, "The strength of generations flows through you. Use it." By the time Samuel's footsteps echoed on the front porch, I was in my own room, supposedly reading, my heart still pounding, but my mind crystal clear, with purpose. The silver locket hung around my neck, hidden beneath my dress, warming my skin with the promise that I wasn't alone in this fight. Tonight, everything would change. Tonight, I would begin the fight my mother had started, armed with knowledge that could destroy the network that had controlled and corrupted my entire life. But first, I had to survive dinner without revealing that I now knew exactly what Samuel Wheeler really was and what he was planning to do to me. Samuel Wheeler had always been a man who appreciated ritual and control. Dinner was served at 6 o'clock. Sharp grace was said with heads bowed and hands folded in perfect submission to his authority, and conversation followed acceptable patterns my day at school. His business in town, observations about weather and neighbors that revealed nothing of real consequence. That evening, as I sat across from him at our small kitchen table, I studied his face, with new eyes seeing the predator that had always lurked beneath the grandfatherly facade. The strong jaw that everyone said I'd inherited looked different now, calculating rather than distinguished. The way he cut his meat, precise and methodical, seemed less like good table manners and more like practice for other kinds of cutting, other forms of systematic dismantling. "You're particularly quiet tonight, sweetheart," he observed, not looking up from his plate of fried chicken and green beans. "Something troubling that pretty little head of yours." The endearment made my skin crawl, but I kept my expression carefully neutral, playing the part of the compliant granddaughter he expected me to be. "Just tired from the heat, I guess. Mrs. Patterson gave us extra arithmetic problems today. Growing girls do need their rest," he said, and there was something in his tone that made me grip my fork tighter, something that suggested rest wasn't what he had planned for my evening. "Speaking of growing up, I've been thinking we should discuss some important changes that are coming in your life." My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to take a bite of mashed potatoes to chew and swallow normally, even though the food felt like sawdust in my mouth. "What kind of changes?" Samuel's smile was warm and indulgent, the expression of a loving grandfather sharing exciting news with his cherished granddaughter. "Well, you're becoming a young woman, Anna. 13 is a very important age, a time when girls begin to understand their proper roles and responsibilities in serving others. There are opportunities available to special young ladies like yourself, opportunities that could shape your entire future in wonderful ways." He paused to take a sip of his coffee, letting the anticipation build, while his pale gray eyes studied my reaction with predatory intensity. "I've been in contact with some very dear friends of mine, the Henderson family, over in Topeka. They're good Christian people who understand the importance of proper guidance for developing young ladies. They've expressed tremendous interest in having you come stay with them for a while." The Hendersons. Even without reading my mother's journal, the name would have filled me with dread because of the way Samuel spoke it like a businessman discussing a particularly profitable client. But now, knowing what I knew about the network, about the systematic trafficking of children disguised as family placements, the casual mention of the Henderson family felt like a death sentence being pronounced over Sunday dinner. "I like living here with you, Grandpa," I said carefully, trying to sound like a nervous child, rather than someone who now understood exactly what was being planned for her. "This is my home. Of course it is, darling, and it always will be. But a girl your age needs certain kinds of instruction that an old man like me isn't equipped to provide. The Hendersons have experience with young ladies. They know how to help them reach their full potential, how to prepare them for the important roles they'll play as adult women." The euphemisms were making me sick, but I forced myself to ask follow-up questions, to act like I was genuinely trying to understand what was expected of me. Every detail would be valuable if I could somehow get my mother's evidence to Agent Harrison, every revelation another nail in Samuel's coffin. "What kind of instruction?" I asked, proud of how innocent and curious I managed to sound. Samuel's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a teacher discussing his favorite subject. "Life skills, dear one. Important lessons about obedience, flexibility, and understanding how to please the adults who care for you. The Hendersons believe that early training is crucial for developing the right attitudes in young ladies, attitudes that will serve them well throughout their lives." "How long would I stay with them?" "And that would depend on how quickly you adapt to their methods and expectations," Samuel replied. "Some young ladies need only a few months to fully appreciate their new circumstances. Others require more intensive instruction before they're ready to move on to their permanent placements. Permanent placements. He was discussing my sale to strangers as if it were a boarding school arrangement, using language that could sound innocent to anyone who didn't understand the true nature of his business. "When would I go?" I whispered, genuinely terrified despite my new knowledge and determination. Samuel reached across the table and patted my hand with grandfatherly affection, his fingers lingering longer than necessary, already practicing the possessive touches that would escalate once I was completely under his control. "Soon, I hope. I'm planning to drive over to Topeka this weekend to meet with Mr. Henderson and finalize the arrangements. It's important that everyone understands the expectations involved, the investment being made in your future development." Investment. Financial arrangements. The casual business language made my stomach churn with revulsion, but I nodded as if his words made perfect sense, as if children were routinely discussed in terms of their market value. After dinner, while Samuel settled on the front porch with his evening pipe, I began implementing the most dangerous part of my desperate strategy. I needed to contact Agent Harrison to let him know that Samuel was accelerating his timeline, that the weekend meeting with the Hendersons was imminent. The phone in our kitchen was an old black rotary model that Samuel used occasionally for farm business and church matters. I'd watched him operate it many times and understood exactly how it worked, but I'd never dared use it without permission. Tonight, while Samuel sat on the porch smoking his pipe and watching the sunset paint our wheat fields gold, I would make the call that might save my life or seal my fate if I was discovered. I waited until I could hear Samuel's satisfied humming from the porch, the tuneless melody he always produced when he was particularly pleased with his day's work. Then, with hands that trembled so violently I could barely manage the rotary dial, I called the operator and asked to be connected to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. "Agent Harrison, please," I whispered when the connection was established. "This is Anna Wheeler. My mother was working with him before she died." There was a pause that felt like eternity. Then a man's voice, deep and reassuring, but underlaid with urgent concern. "Anna, dear God, we've been waiting for you to contact us for years. Your mother was helping us build a case against a trafficking network operating in your area, and we know you're in immediate danger. Can you speak freely?" "For a few minutes. Samuel's on the porch, but he'll come looking for me if I'm gone too long." "Listen to me very carefully, Anna. We know about Samuel Wheeler's operation, about the corruption in your local law enforcement that protects him, about his plans to transfer you to the Henderson family in Topeka. Your mother gathered extensive evidence before she was killed, but we need current information to move forward with arrests. Are you willing to help us gather that evidence?" My heart raced with a mixture of hope and terror, so intense I could barely breathe. Agent Harrison knew everything about Samuel, about the network, about my mother's murder disguised as an accident. But more importantly, he was offering me a chance to fight back. "Yes," I whispered. "What do you need me to do?" "We need you to wear a recording device during your meeting with the Hendersons. If we can document Samuel negotiating your sale, discussing financial arrangements, describing the services you'll be expected to provide, then we'll have enough evidence to arrest the entire network." A recording device. The technology existed to capture Samuel's words, to preserve his confessions for use in court. But the danger was enormous if he discovered what I was doing, if he realized I was working with federal authorities. "Anna, I need you to understand how dangerous this is," Agent Harrison continued, as if reading my thoughts. "Samuel Wheeler has killed to protect his operation. Your mother isn't the only person who's died trying to expose him. If he suspects what you're planning, I know," I said, thinking about my mother's journal, about the courage it had taken for her to gather evidence while living with the enemy. "But I can't let him sell me to the Hendersons. I can't let him keep destroying other children's lives. You're incredibly brave, just like your mother was. But you won't be doing this alone. We'll have agents positioned around the Henderson property, ready to intervene at the first sign of danger. Your safety is our absolute priority." Agent Harrison gave me detailed instructions for a meeting the next afternoon, when I could pick up the recording equipment and receive training on how to use it safely. The device would be small enough to hide in my clothing, powerful enough to capture conversations from across a room, and connected to receivers that would allow federal agents to monitor everything in real time. "One more thing, Anna," Agent Harrison said as our call neared its end. "There's something about your father that you need to know, something your mother discovered just before she was killed." My blood ran cold. "What about my father?" "He wasn't another victim of Samuel's network. He was Samuel's partner. Your mother found evidence that Robert Wheeler had been involved in trafficking children for over 15 years. When she threatened to expose them both, they arranged her murder to protect their operation." The phone slipped from my hand, clattering against the kitchen wall as the full scope of the betrayal crashed over me. My father, the man I'd mourned as a loving parent who died trying to protect his family, had been planning to sell me like livestock. The car accident that killed both my parents hadn't been caused by bad weather. It had been murder orchestrated to silence my mother and deliver me back into the hands of the monsters who owned me. I picked up the phone with shaking hands, my voice barely audible. "I understand. I'm sorry you had to learn the truth this way, Anna. But you needed to know what you're really fighting against. This isn't just about stopping Samuel. It's about exposing an entire network of corruption that has protected child traffickers for decades." I hung up just as Samuel's footsteps approached the kitchen, my heart pounding with a combination of terror and determination that made me feel like I might explode. Tomorrow, I would begin the most dangerous mission of my life, armed with recording equipment and the knowledge that I was completely alone except for federal agents who might or might not be able to save me if things went wrong. "Who were you talking to, sweetheart?" Samuel asked as he entered the kitchen, his pale gray eyes sharp with suspicion. I called Jenny Peterson about our arithmetic homework." I lied, smoothly, amazed at how steady my voice sounded. "Mrs. Patterson wants us to work together on the problems she assigned." Samuel's expression softened into grandfatherly approval. "It's good that you're taking your education seriously, even though you won't be needing it much longer. The Hendersons believe that too much book learning can make young ladies difficult to manage properly." As he spoke about the Hendersons' educational philosophy, which apparently involved keeping their victims ignorant and dependent, I touched the silver locket hidden beneath my dress and thought about my mother's courage, about the evidence she'd died trying to preserve, about the network of survivor women who were still fighting to protect children like me. Tomorrow, I would honor their sacrifice by taking the biggest risk of my life. Tomorrow, I would either help bring justice to the monsters who destroyed my family, or I would join the long list of children who disappeared into Samuel Wheeler's network, never to be seen again. But tonight, I had to survive Samuel's escalating attentions as he prepared me for the weekend that would determine my fate. The next day passed with agonizing slowness, each hour marked by my growing awareness that I was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Samuel was unusually cheerful during breakfast, humming hymns, while he read his newspaper and discussing his plans for the weekend meeting with casual enthusiasm that made my skin crawl. "I spoke with Mr. Henderson yesterday evening," he said as he buttered his toast with meticulous precision. "He's very eager to meet you personally to evaluate your suitability for their household programs. I assured him that you're exceptionally well prepared for the kind of guidance they specialize in providing." I nodded silently, forcing myself to eat scrambled eggs that tasted like sawdust, while Samuel outlined the Hendersons' expectations for my behavior during our visit. Every instruction was designed to present me as compliant and trainable, a perfect candidate for whatever horrors their household programs involved. At 2:00, while Samuel was in town conducting business at the grain elevator, I slipped away from our farmhouse and walked the 3 miles to the designated meeting location, an abandoned grain silo on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge that had been empty since the drought of 1952. The Kansas heat made the walk feel like a trek through an oven, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the anxiety that churned in my stomach as I approached the rusted metal structure. Agent Harrison was waiting inside the silo's shadowy interior, a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my appearance as I entered. He wore civilian clothes rather than a uniform, but there was something about his posture and bearing that radiated authority and competence. "Ah, Anna," he said, gently extending his hand in greeting. "I knew your mother well. She was one of the bravest women I've ever worked with, and from what I can see, you've inherited her courage." The comparison filled me with pride and grief in equal measure. "Agent Harrison, I found more of her evidence last night. She documented everything: the network, the buyers, the financial arrangements. There are names of people I recognize, people everyone in town respects and trusts." His expression grew grim. "That's consistent with what we've learned from other sources. Samuel Wheeler didn't build his operation alone. He had help from law enforcement, judges, church leaders, and business owners who benefited from keeping his activities protected and his victims silenced." Agent Harrison opened a leather briefcase and withdrew what looked like a small radio, no bigger than a deck of cards. "This is the recording device you'll be wearing during your visit to the Henderson house. It's designed to be sewn into the lining of your clothing where it won't be detected even if they search you for weapons or contraband." He spent the next hour teaching me how to operate the device, how to position myself for optimal recording quality, how to recognize the warning signs that my cover might be blown. The technology was more sophisticated than anything I'd imagined possible, capable of transmitting clear audio to receivers positioned up to a mile away. "Federal agents will be monitoring everything in real time," Agent Harrison explained. "If Samuel or the Hendersons say anything that suggests immediate danger, if they attempt to harm you or prevent you from leaving with Samuel after the meeting, we'll intervene immediately." "What if they don't let me leave? What if they decide to keep me there?" Agent Harrison's expression grew fierce with determination. "That won't happen, Anna. We have teams positioned around the Henderson property, and we know every entrance and exit. If they try to detain you against your will, they'll discover that the federal government takes a very dim view of kidnapping." The recording device was sewn into the lining of my best dress that evening, invisible to casual inspection, but present as a constant reminder of the dangerous game I was about to play. As I prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring either salvation or disaster, I touched my mother's silver locket and whispered a prayer for courage. Samuel's nighttime visit to my room was particularly invasive that evening, his hands exploring boundaries he'd never dared cross before, while he spoke in grandfatherly tones about the special lessons I would learn from the Hendersons. They believe in thorough preparation," he murmured as his fingers traced patterns on my skin that made me want to scrub myself raw. "By the time they're finished with your training, you'll understand exactly how to please the adults who care for you, how to demonstrate proper gratitude for the opportunities you've been given." I lay perfectly still and endured his violations while the recording device captured every word, every casual admission of his plans for my systematic destruction. By morning, Agent Harrison would have audio evidence of Samuel Wheeler grooming a child for sale to known traffickers, evidence that would ensure his conviction, even if everything else went wrong. But as Samuel finally left my room and locked the door behind him, I understood that surviving the night was only the beginning of my ordeal. Tomorrow, I would walk willingly into the Henderson house, into the heart of the trafficking network that had destroyed so many young lives. Tomorrow, I would either emerge as a witness whose testimony could bring down an empire of evil, or I would disappear forever into the darkness that had swallowed countless children before me. Saturday morning arrived gray and humid, with the kind of oppressive air that made breathing feel like work. Samuel was up before dawn, shaving carefully and dressing in his best suit as if he were preparing for church rather than delivering a child to traffickers. He seemed genuinely excited about the day's prospects, humming while he prepared breakfast and checking his pocket watch with increasing frequency. Today is the beginning of your real education, Anna," he said as we ate our eggs and bacon in the pre-dawn darkness. "The Hendersons will teach you things that I simply couldn't, lessons about your proper role in the world, about the importance of serving others without question or complaint." I nodded silently. my stomach too twisted with anxiety to handle much food. The recording device felt like it was burning against my skin, a constant reminder of the federal agents who were already positioning themselves around the Henderson property, preparing to document whatever horrors were about to unfold. The drive to Topeka took 2 hours. 2 hours of Samuel's increasingly animated discussion of my bright future with the Henderson family. He spoke about them with the kind of professional respect one businessman shows for another, discussing their methods and success rates, as if he were recommending a particularly effective school rather than describing child traffickers. "Mr. Henderson has been in this business for nearly 20 years, Samuel explained as we drove through the Kansas countryside. He has contacts throughout the Midwest connections that ensure his young ladies are placed in appropriate situations when their training is complete. The girls who graduate from his program are highly sought after by families who appreciate quality and proper preparation." Graduate, placed, training. The euphemisms made me sick, but they also provided exactly the kind of evidence Agent Harrison needed to prove that Samuel was operating a commercial trafficking network, rather than simply abusing children within his family. "What happens to the girls after they graduate?" I asked, genuinely curious despite my terror. Samuel's smile was indulgent paternal. "They move on to serve families who can provide them with opportunities I could never offer: travel, fine clothes, experiences that most farm girls could never imagine. Of course, they earn those privileges through dedicated service and absolute obedience to their new household's expectations." The Henderson house was located in an upscale Topeka neighborhood, a large Victorian mansion painted white with green shutters and surrounded by mature trees that provided privacy from neighboring properties. It looked like respectability itself, the kind of place where wealthy families might live, where children would be safe and loved and protected from the dangers of the world. Nothing about its exterior suggested the horrors that took place behind its elegant facade. Mr. Henderson met us at the front door, before we could even knock, a distinguished man in his 50s with graying hair, and the kind of practiced smile I'd learned to recognize on predators. He was shorter than Samuel, but carried himself with similar authority, the confidence of someone accustomed to having his desires catered to without question. "Samuel, my dear friend," Henderson said warmly, extending his hand in greeting. "And this must be the lovely Anna we've heard so much about. She's every bit as beautiful as you described, even more so, in fact." His eyes moved over me with calculating assessment, the same look Samuel got when he was evaluating livestock at the county fair. I forced myself to stand still under his scrutiny, to play the part of the compliant child being prepared for sale, while the recording device captured every word of their interaction. "Anna, say hello to Mr. Henderson," Samuel prompted. "Hello, sir," I said quietly, offering a small curtsy that Samuel had coached me to perform. "Thank you for inviting me to visit your home." Henderson's smile widened with obvious approval. "Such excellent manners. You've done wonderful work with her, Samuel. I can see why she's generated so much interest among our clientele." Clientele. The word confirmed that the Henderson house was indeed a commercial operation, serving paying customers who purchased access to the children in their care. Henderson gestured for us to enter the house, leading us through a foyer decorated with expensive furniture and artwork that spoke of significant wealth generated by their trafficking activities. Everything was perfectly arranged, immaculately clean, the kind of household where children learned quickly not to touch anything without permission. "Come into my study," Henderson suggested. "We can discuss the business arrangements while Mrs. Henderson shows Anna around the house and evaluates her readiness for our programs." As if summoned by his words, a woman appeared from a side hallway, tall, thin, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a dark dress that looked more like a uniform than casual clothing, and when she smiled at me, it was like watching a snake decide whether I was worth the effort of striking. "Anna?" She said, her voice pleasant enough, but with an undertone that raised every alarm bell in my body. "What a pretty young lady you are. Come with me, dear. I'll show you where you'll be staying and explain how our household operates." This was the moment I'd been dreading, the separation that would leave me alone with Mrs. Henderson while Samuel and her husband discussed my purchase price. But it was also the opportunity. Agent Harrison needed the chance to record both sides of the trafficking transaction simultaneously. I looked back at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly, then followed Mrs. Henderson up a grand staircase that led to the second floor of the mansion. Behind us, I could hear Samuel and Henderson entering the study, their voices already taking on the confidential tones of men conducting sensitive business. Mrs. Henderson led me down a long hallway lined with closed doors, the house feeling enormous and maze-like, the kind of place where screams might go unheard and escape attempts could be easily thwarted. She stopped at a door near the end of the corridor and produced a key from her pocket, the first sign that the children in this house were prisoners rather than guests. "This will be your room," she said, opening the door to reveal a space that looked more like a prison cell than a bedroom. There was a narrow bed with plain white sheets, a small dresser, and a single window with bars that had been painted to look decorative but were clearly functional. "It's very nice," I said, because she seemed to expect a response. "We believe in simplicity for our young ladies." Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her rules followed without question. Too many possessions can be distracting from the important work of personal development and service training. She showed me the adjoining bathroom, also sparse with a lock on the outside of the door rather than the inside, and explained the house rules in the same tone other people might use to discuss the weather. No leaving the second floor without explicit permission. No contact with the outside world under any circumstances. No resistance to instruction or discipline, regardless of how unusual the requirements might seem. The girls who do well here are the ones who learn quickly that cooperation leads to comfort. She said, her words carrying the weight of threat despite their motherly delivery. Those who struggle against their circumstances tend to find life much more challenging than necessary. It was a warning delivered with gentle sweetness, and it told me everything I needed to know about what happened to children who didn't adapt quickly enough to the Henderson household's expectations. Downstairs, I could hear the murmur of male voices from the study, occasional laughter, the sound of a business deal being negotiated with the casual confidence of men who had never faced consequences for their actions. Samuel was discussing my value, my training requirements, the timeline for my complete transformation from granddaughter to commodity. "The financial arrangements are quite generous," Mrs. Henderson continued as we completed the tour. "Your grandfather clearly values your future development highly enough to invest significantly in proper training. That level of commitment usually indicates that a young lady has exceptional potential. Exceptional potential for what she didn't specify. But the implications were clear enough to make my stomach churn with revulsion and fear. "Shall we rejoin the men?" Mrs. Henderson suggested, after showing me the common areas where I would be expected to spend my supervised time. "I'm sure they're eager to finalize the arrangements and discuss the transition timeline." We walked back downstairs together, Mrs. Henderson's hand resting lightly on my shoulder, in a gesture that looked protective but felt possessive. The recording device was capturing every word, every casual revelation about the Henderson household's operations, building the case that would eventually bring them all to justice. In the study, Samuel and Henderson were seated in leather armchairs with glasses of whiskey, looking like old friends celebrating a successful business transaction. A manila envelope sat on Henderson's desk, thick enough to contain substantial payment for my purchase. "Ah, there you are," Samuel said when we entered. "Mr. Henderson and I have been discussing the timeline for your transition to his household, and I'm pleased to report that everything is proceeding exactly as planned. And I must say," Henderson added, "Mrs. Henderson's preliminary evaluation is quite positive. We're prepared to move forward with the full training program, assuming the financial arrangements meet with your approval." Samuel's smile was triumphant, satisfied. "They're more than acceptable, my friend. I'm confident that Anna will prove to be everything you're hoping for and more." Henderson reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a leather portfolio from which he extracted the envelope I'd noticed earlier. "The initial payment, as we discussed. The remainder will be transferred once Anna has completed her adjustment period. and we've confirmed her suitability for advanced training." Samuel accepted the envelope with obvious pleasure, tucking it into his jacket pocket without counting the contents. The casual exchange of money for access to a child was being recorded in perfect detail, providing Agent Harrison with irrefutable evidence of human trafficking. "When can we expect the transfer to be completed?" Henderson asked. "Next weekend, if that suits your schedule," Samuel replied. "That will give Anna time to prepare mentally and practically for her new life, and it will allow me to complete some final business arrangements." Next weekend, 7 more days of living with Samuel, 7 more days of his escalating violations as he prepared me for sale, but also 7 more days for Agent Harrison to coordinate arrests to position federal agents to ensure that the entire network would be taken down simultaneously. Perfect," Henderson said, standing and extending his hand to Samuel. "It's always a pleasure doing business with you, my friend. Your young ladies are consistently excellent investments." As the men shook hands, sealing my fate like I was nothing more than livestock changing ownership, I thought about all the girls who had stood in this same room before me, watching the same handshake that condemned them to months or years of systematic abuse and exploitation. But I also thought about the recording device capturing every word about Agent Harrison and his team, listening to the evidence they needed to destroy this network forever. Unlike those other girls, I wouldn't disappear into the Henderson house without a trace. Unlike them, I had allies working to save me and stop the monsters who bought and sold children like commodities. The drive back to Cedar Ridge passed in Samuel's satisfied silence, broken only by his occasional humming and the crinkle of the envelope in his pocket paper, evidence of what I was worth on the market for stolen childhoods. But hidden in the lining of my dress, the recording device held something far more valuable. The voices of predators convicting themselves out of their own mouths, providing federal prosecutors with everything they needed to end this nightmare forever. That evening, as Samuel celebrated his successful negotiation with an extra glass of whiskey after dinner, I excused myself early and climbed the stairs to my room, where I would spend the next few hours transcribing everything I'd witnessed for Agent Harrison's files. But more importantly, I would be preparing for the most dangerous week of my life, 7 days of pretending to be the compliant victim Samuel expected, while federal agents prepared to bring justice to the network that had destroyed so many innocent lives. The hardest part was over. Now I just had to survive long enough to see Samuel Wheeler and his associates brought to justice. The next few days passed in a carefully orchestrated performance that nearly broke my spirit. Samuel's behavior grew increasingly possessive and invasive as my transfer date approached, his hands wandering with bold confidence during our daily interactions, his voice taking on proprietary tones when he spoke about my future with the Hendersons. But it was on Wednesday afternoon, while Samuel was in town meeting with his banker to arrange the financial aspects of my sale, that I made the discovery that shattered whatever remained of my childhood innocence. I had been searching Samuel's study for additional evidence to pass along to Agent Harrison when I noticed that my father's old desk, the roll-top oak piece that had been moved to the farmhouse after my parents' death, had a drawer that didn't quite align properly with the others. Running my hands along the back panel, I discovered a hidden compartment that opened to reveal a collection of leather-bound journals tied with string. My father's private records hidden away like shameful secrets. For 8 years, I had mourned Robert Wheeler as another victim of Samuel's evil, imagining him as a loving parent who had died trying to protect his family from the monster who controlled our lives. But as I opened the first journal and began reading his careful handwriting, a completely different and far more devastating truth emerged from the pages. January 15th, 1946. Samuel taught me the business properly today. 20 girls moved through the network this quarter, generating over $40,000 in gross revenue. My cut as transportation coordinator was $8,000 more money than I could make in 5 years of railroad work. Anna is already showing the kind of beauty that will command premium prices when she reaches the right age. Samuel estimates she could bring in $15,000 or more, depending on buyer preferences and market conditions. The clinical language made my stomach turn. My own father had been calculating my market value when I was only 4 years old, planning my eventual sale like a farmer deciding when to bring livestock to auction. March 3, 1946. The Chicago buyers are requesting younger inventory for their spring catalog. Samuel has identified 3 possibilities in Junction City, but transportation will be tricky given the increased highway patrols. I've worked out a routing system using railroad freight cars that should allow us to move merchandise without detection. The investment in custom shipping containers was substantial, but it will pay for itself within 6 months. Merchandise, inventory, shipping containers. My father wrote about children the way other businessmen discussed automobile parts or agricultural products. July 22, 1946. Anna asked me today why some of her little friends from school have moved away so suddenly. I told her their families found better opportunities in other towns, but the truth is more complex. Samuel identified 3 of her classmates as having the physical characteristics preferred by our premium buyers. The parents were reluctant at first, but financial pressures and Samuel's influence in the community ultimately convinced them that selling their daughters was the best option for everyone involved. I had to stop reading to vomit in Samuel's wastepaper basket. My own friends, Jenny Peterson, Marie Collins, little Katie Thompson, who had sat next to me in 2nd grade, had been sold through my father and grandfather's network. Their disappearances hadn't been family relocations. They had been kidnappings disguised as voluntary departures. December 1st, 1946. Sarah is asking too many questions about the business, showing too much interest in the financial records I keep here at home. I've moved the most sensitive documents to Samuel's safe, but I'm concerned about her growing suspicions. She found one of the buyer catalogs last week and demanded explanations I couldn't provide without revealing everything. Samuel thinks we may need to consider more permanent solutions to the Sarah problem. The Sarah problem, my mother's growing awareness of their criminal activities, was being discussed like a business obstacle that required elimination. April 10, 1947. Sarah confronted me directly tonight about the trafficking operation. She has somehow obtained copies of our financial records, photographs of children who have gone through the network, and names of buyers in multiple states. She threatened to expose everything unless I help her rescue Anna and testify against Samuel. I told her she doesn't understand how powerful our protection network has become. Local law enforcement judges, church leaders, and state officials all benefit from keeping our operation running smoothly. But Sarah is determined to fight anyway. Samuel is right, she has become too dangerous to allow her continued existence. My hands shook so violently I could barely turn the pages. My father hadn't been trying to protect me from Samuel's evil. He had been planning to eliminate my mother to protect their joint business interests. April 14, 1947. The arrangements are finalized. Samuel has contacts in the State Highway Department who can arrange for weather-related accidents during tomorrow night's thunderstorm. Sarah believes we are driving to Kansas City to meet with federal agents, but the car has been modified to ensure that any collision will be fatal for the passengers while leaving the driver with survivable injuries. I will be thrown clear during the rollover, allowing me to return to Samuel's house with the tragic news that Sarah died trying to save Anna from imaginary dangers. The insurance money will provide additional operating capital for next year's expansion. The final entries detailed my father's preparations for murdering my mother and staging his own death to cover up their crime. But the last entry, dated the day of the accident, revealed a twist that made the betrayal even more complete. April 15, 1947. Samuel called this morning with a change of plans. The state police have been asking too many questions about our operation, and there are rumors that federal agents are planning an investigation. He thinks it would be safer if both Sarah and I died in the accident, eliminating any potential witnesses who could implicate him if the authorities become too persistent. The car modifications will ensure that neither of us survives the crash, and Samuel will raise Anna according to our original plans. She will still generate the revenue we projected, but now all the profits will remain within his organization rather than being split with partners who have become liabilities. My father had been murdered by his own partner, killed to protect the network he had helped build and expand. Samuel Wheeler hadn't just stolen my childhood. He had orchestrated the deaths of both my parents to ensure his complete control over my life and eventual sale to the highest bidder. I closed the journal and sat in my father's chair, surrounded by the evidence of betrayals so complete and devastating that I could barely process their implications. Not only had I been living with the monster who planned to sell me, but I was the daughter of another monster who had helped design the system that trapped and destroyed children across multiple states. But in the midst of that crushing realization, I found something unexpected, a fierce determination that burned like white fire in my chest. My mother had been a warrior, fighting battles she knew might cost her life, standing against evil, despite the odds against her survival. The strength she had shown, the courage she had demonstrated in her final weeks, lived on in me, her daughter, her legacy, her weapon against the forces that had destroyed her. That evening, when Samuel returned from town with news about the final preparations for my transfer to the Hendersons, I sat across from him at dinner and smiled like the compliant granddaughter he expected me to be. But inside, I was planning the complete destruction of everything he had built, everything my father had helped create, everything that had allowed monsters like them to profit from the systematic abuse of innocent children. The recording device had captured his negotiations with the Hendersons. My father's journals provided detailed documentation of the network's operations, financial structure, and key participants. My mother's evidence revealed the scope of corruption that protected their activities. Agent Harrison now had everything he needed to prosecute not just Samuel and the Hendersons, but the entire network of buyers, sellers, and corrupt officials who had made their crimes possible. Tomorrow, I would deliver the final pieces of evidence that would bring justice for my mother, for the children who had disappeared, and for every victim who had suffered in silence while monsters counted their profits. Samuel Wheeler's empire was about to collapse, and I would be the one who brought it down. Friday evening arrived with the same oppressive humidity that had marked the entire summer, but this time the heavy air felt charged with anticipation rather than dread. Samuel was particularly cheerful during dinner, discussing his final preparations for tomorrow's delivery with the casual confidence of a businessman closing a routine transaction. "Mr. Henderson called this afternoon to confirm our appointment," he said, while cutting his pork chop with precise, methodical movements. "He's very eager to begin your orientation to their household programs. Mrs. Henderson has prepared a complete wardrobe for you, dresses that reflect their standards for young ladies in training." I nodded silently, playing the part of the nervous but compliant child he expected, while my mind raced through the final details of Agent Harrison's plan. Federal agents were already positioning themselves around the Henderson property, monitoring equipment was being tested, and arrest warrants had been prepared for every member of the trafficking network identified in my parents' evidence. "I want you to understand, Anna." Samuel continued, his pale gray eyes taking on the intensity that always preceded his most manipulative speeches, "that what happens tomorrow will determine the course of your entire future. The Hendersons are offering you opportunities that most farm girls could never imagine, chances to see the world, to serve important people, to learn skills that will make you valuable in ways you can't yet comprehend." Valuable. The word carried layers of meaning that made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to respond appropriately. "I understand, Grandpa. I want to make you proud." His smile was warm, grandfatherly, terrifying in its complete sincerity. "You will, sweetheart. You're going to be everything I've always known you could be." After dinner, while Samuel settled on the front porch with his evening pipe, I made my final contact with Agent Harrison, using the emergency communication protocol we had established. The signal was simple, a specific pattern of light flashes from my bedroom window that would be visible to federal agents monitoring our farmhouse from a distance. Within minutes, my bedroom telephone, a direct line Agent Harrison had secretly installed during one of Samuel's trips to town, rang with the soft chime that indicated secure communication. "Anna, this is Agent Harrison. Are you ready for tomorrow?" "Yes, sir." Samuel confirmed that we're meeting the Hendersons at 10 o'clock. He's bringing the financial documents and expects to complete the transfer immediately. Excellent. Our teams are in position, and we've coordinated with federal prosecutors to ensure simultaneous arrests across 3 states. By tomorrow evening, the entire network will be in custody. Agent Harrison's voice carried confidence, but I could hear the underlying concern that we both felt about the dangers inherent in our plan. Remember, Anna, your safety is our absolute priority. If anything feels wrong, if Samuel or the Hendersons deviate from their expected behavior, signal us immediately and we'll intervene. I will. Agent Harrison, there's something else. I found my father's journals detailed records of the network's operations, financial transactions, transportation methods. He documented everything. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats. Everything, including his role in my mother's murder. Samuel killed them both to eliminate witnesses and maintain complete control over the operation. My father wasn't a victim, he was Samuel's full partner until he became a liability. Dear God. Anna, I'm sorry you had to discover the truth that way. But those journals will provide crucial evidence for prosecuting the entire conspiracy. You've done something remarkable. You've given us everything we need to ensure that justice is finally served. As I prepared for bed that night, knowing it would be my last night in Samuel's house, I touched my mother's silver locket and whispered a promise to her memory. Tomorrow, the network that had destroyed our family would be exposed and dismantled. Tomorrow, the children who had suffered in silence would see their tormentors brought to justice. But first, I had to survive one more night of Samuel's escalating attentions, one final session of the grooming process that had been building toward my complete destruction. His footsteps on the stairs came earlier than usual, heavy with anticipation and whiskey-fueled confidence. When he knocked on my door, his voice carried a different quality, hungrier, more possessive, tinged with the excitement of a predator who believed his prey was finally within reach. Anna, sweetheart, may I come in? We need to have our final conversation before your big day tomorrow. I unlocked the door and stepped back, allowing him to enter my room with the swagger of a man who believed he owned everything in it, including me. Samuel was carrying a small wrapped package and wearing the expression of grandfatherly indulgence that had fooled the entire town for decades. I have something special for you, he said, settling onto my bed with casual familiarity. A going-away present to help you remember our special relationship after you begin your new life. The package contained a delicate gold bracelet, beautiful, expensive, and completely inappropriate as a gift from a grandfather to his granddaughter. But more disturbing than the jewelry itself was the way Samuel fastened it around my wrist, his fingers lingering on my skin with possessive intimacy. This bracelet has special significance, he explained, his voice taking on the lecturing tone that always preceded his worst violations. It belonged to your mother when she was your age, when she was learning the same lessons that you're about to learn. She wore it during her training with my previous business partner, and now you'll wear it during your training with the Hendersons. My mother's bracelet. He had kept it as a trophy, a reminder of his successful destruction of her innocence, and now he was passing it on to me as a symbol of continuing the cycle of abuse. The Hendersons will explain its significance to you, Samuel continued, but I wanted you to understand that wearing it connects you to a tradition that goes back generations in our family. Your great-grandmother wore it. Your grandmother wore it. Your mother wore it, and now you'll wear it as you learn to fulfill your proper purpose in life. Generations. The trafficking network wasn't something Samuel had created. It was a family business passed down through multiple generations of Wheeler men who had been selling their female relatives for over a century. As Samuel's hands began their familiar exploration, as his voice took on the hypnotic quality he used to normalize his violations, I forced myself to remain still and compliant while the recording device captured every word of his final confession. He spoke about my training, my value, my destiny as merchandise to be sold to the highest bidder, providing Agent Harrison with audio evidence that would ensure his conviction, even if every other piece of evidence disappeared. But more importantly, Samuel revealed the full scope of the network he had inherited and expanded names of buyers, locations, of training facilities, methods for transporting children across state lines, and the system of corruption that had protected their operations for decades. Tomorrow, you'll begin learning what it truly means to serve, he whispered, as his violations escalated beyond anything he had dared attempt before. The Hendersons will teach you to find pleasure in submission, to take pride in your ability to satisfy adult needs, to understand that your value lies in your willingness to be whatever your owners require. His words were being recorded, preserved, prepared for presentation to federal prosecutors who would use them to destroy him and everyone associated with his network. But in the moment, as I endured his complete destruction of my remaining innocence, I focused on my mother's locket warming against my skin and the promise I had made to her memory. This was the last time Samuel Wheeler would ever touch me. This was the last time he would ever hurt any child. Tomorrow, justice would finally come to Cedar Ridge, Kansas, and the monsters who had hidden behind respectability would face the consequences of their crimes. When Samuel finally left my room, locking the door behind him with satisfied confidence in his complete dominion over my life, I lay perfectly still and listened to his footsteps retreat down the hallway. Then, and only then, did I allow myself to smile. The trap was set, the evidence was recorded, the federal agents were ready. Samuel Wheeler's reign of terror was about to end forever. Saturday morning dawned with deceptive beauty. Golden sunlight streaming across the Kansas wheat fields, gentle breezes carrying the sweet scent of approaching harvest, the kind of perfect day that should have been filled with simple pleasures rather than life-or-death confrontations with evil. Samuel was up early whistling hymns while he prepared for what he believed would be his final business transaction involving me. He dressed in his best suit, combed his silver hair with extra care, and checked his pocket watch repeatedly as if eager to begin the day's profitable activities. "Today marks the beginning of your real education, Anna," he said as we shared what I hoped would be our last breakfast together. "The Hendersons will teach you things I simply couldn't, lessons about your proper place in the world, about the importance of serving others without question or complaint." I nodded silently, my stomach too twisted with anxiety to handle much food, despite knowing I would need strength for whatever lay ahead. The recording device felt warm against my skin, a reminder that federal agents were already monitoring our conversations, preparing to document whatever horrors were about to unfold. But as we prepared to leave for Topeka, as Samuel loaded his briefcase with the financial documents and legal papers necessary for transferring ownership of me to the Henderson family, I began to notice subtle signs that something was wrong. A car I didn't recognize was parked at the end of our driveway, too far away for me to see the occupants clearly, but positioned where it could monitor everyone entering or leaving our property. Samuel glanced at it several times, but his expression showed satisfaction rather than concern, as if the surveillance was expected rather than threatening. "There." "Samuel," a familiar voice called from our front porch as we prepared to get into his truck. Sheriff Morrison emerged from behind the house wearing his uniform and carrying himself with official authority. "Might I have a word before you leave for your business in Topeka?" My blood ran cold. Sheriff Morrison was supposed to be part of the corrupt network that protected Samuel's operation, but Agent Harrison had assured me that federal agents would be handling all aspects of today's arrests. Local law enforcement wasn't supposed to be involved at all. "Of course, Bob," Samuel replied with easy familiarity. "What can I do for you?" "Well, it's a delicate matter." Sheriff Morrison said, his eyes moving between Samuel and me with an expression I couldn't interpret. "We've received some concerns about Anna's well-being from certain parties who claim to have information about irregular activities involving minors in our county." Samuel's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "I can't imagine what you mean, Bob. Anna is my granddaughter, and I've always provided her with proper care and Christian guidance." "I'm sure you have, Samuel. But these accusations are coming from federal authorities, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation specifically." They're claiming to have evidence of trafficking activities, financial records, even recordings of conversations between you and certain parties in Topeka. The trap was springing, but not in the way Agent Harrison had planned. Sheriff Morrison was supposed to be under federal surveillance, not conducting his own investigation. Something had gone catastrophically wrong with our carefully coordinated operation. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," Samuel said carefully. "Anna and I are simply visiting friends in Topeka today. Family friends who've offered to provide guidance for a young lady who's lost her parents." Sheriff Morrison nodded sympathetically. "I'm sure that's all it is, Samuel. But I'm afraid I'll need to ask Anna a few questions privately just to clear up these federal concerns before they escalate into something more serious." As Sheriff Morrison approached me, I noticed that the car at the end of our driveway had moved closer, and I could now see that it contained several men in suits who looked more like federal agents than local law enforcement. But their presence felt wrong somehow, too obvious, too aggressive, not at all like the careful surveillance Agent Harrison had described. "Anna, sweetheart," Sheriff Morrison said gently, "these federal agents would like to speak with you about your living situation here with your grandfather. They're concerned that someone might be spreading false information about your family, and they need your help to set the record straight." False information. Federal agents who were asking local law enforcement to conduct their interviews. A setup that felt completely different from what Agent Harrison had prepared me to expect. The terrible truth hit me like a physical blow. I had been betrayed. The corruption in Cedar Ridge ran deeper than Agent Harrison had realized, extending beyond local officials to the federal agents themselves. The man I had trusted, the person I had believed would save me, was part of Samuel's network. "Error." "Sheriff Morrison," I said carefully, "could I speak with Agent Harrison directly? He's been helping me understand some things about my family history, and I'd like to make sure he knows I'm cooperating fully." The sheriff and Samuel exchanged a look that confirmed my worst fears. "I'm afraid Agent Harrison won't be joining us today, dear," Sheriff Morrison replied. "He's been reassigned to other duties, but these federal representatives are fully authorized to handle any concerns you might have." Reassigned. The euphemism was delivered with practiced casualness, but I understood its real meaning. Agent Harrison had either been silenced, eliminated, or revealed as another corrupt official, playing a deeper game than I had realized. The men from the car were approaching now, wearing suits and badges that looked official, but felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Their expressions were too confident, too satisfied, like predators who had successfully cornered their prey. "Miss Wheeler," the lead agent said with grandfatherly kindness that reminded me sickeningly of Samuel's manipulative tone, "we understand you've been having some troubling episodes lately, making up stories about your family, imagining threats that don't really exist. We're here to help you get the treatment you need to overcome these unfortunate delusions." Treatment. Delusions. The same language Samuel had used when describing his plans for institutionalizing me if I ever tried to expose his activities. "We've arranged for you to stay at a special facility where you can receive proper care for your emotional problems," another agent added. "Your grandfather has provided us with extensive documentation of your declining mental state, including recordings of conversations where you make clearly false accusations against respected members of your community." Recordings. They had turned my own evidence against me using the devices Agent Harrison had provided to create a narrative of mental illness rather than abuse. Every word I had spoken about Samuel's crimes would now be presented as proof of my psychological instability. The trap was perfect, elegant in its simplicity. If I protested, if I tried to reveal what was really happening, they would simply point to my emotional instability as proof that I couldn't be trusted. The real federal agents, if any existed, would never hear my testimony, because I would disappear into a psychiatric facility controlled by the same network that had been trafficking children for decades. "Mo, the Menninger Clinic in Topeka has agreed to provide specialized treatment for cases like yours," Sheriff Morrison added with professional compassion. "They have extensive experience helping young ladies who've experienced trauma-induced psychological episodes." The Menninger Clinic. Not the Henderson house, but another facility controlled by the network, another place where children disappeared and were never seen again. They had adapted their plans to account for my resistance, creating an alternative narrative that would achieve the same result through different means. But as the agents moved to escort me to their waiting car, as Samuel watched with the satisfaction of a man whose problems were being solved by powerful allies, I made a decision that would either save my life or end it. I was not going quietly. I was not disappearing into their system without a fight. And if Agent Harrison had been silenced or corrupted, if the federal government couldn't be trusted to protect children from monsters like Samuel Wheeler, then I would find another way to expose the truth. I need to use the bathroom before we leave, I said quietly, my voice steady, despite the terror coursing through my veins. Sheriff Morrison nodded indulgently. Of course, dear. Take all the time you need. As I walked toward our farmhouse, my mind was already implementing a desperate plan that would either reveal the scope of the network's corruption or ensure that I died fighting rather than disappearing into their system of abuse and exploitation. The real battle was just beginning. The moment I closed the bathroom door behind me, I moved with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether I lived or died as a free person. The bathroom window was narrow, but not impossible for someone my size, and more importantly, it faced the back of our farmhouse, where the corrupt agents couldn't see my escape. I forced open the window latch, rusted with age, but still functional, and squeezed through the opening, dropping to the ground in our vegetable garden, with a thud that knocked the breath from my lungs. But I was free, at least temporarily, and I had a destination in mind that represented my last hope for salvation. Margaret Harrison's house was 3 miles away, but I knew every back road and cattle path between our farm and her property. If Agent Harrison's sister was still alive, if she was still part of the network of survivor women my mother had described then, she might have contacts outside Cedar Ridge who could expose the truth about Samuel's operation. I ran through wheat fields and along irrigation ditches, my heart pounding as I heard shouts from the farmhouse behind me. They had discovered my escape, and I knew it would only be minutes before they organized search teams to track me down systematically. But I had one advantage: they didn't expect I knew the countryside better than city agents ever could, and I was motivated by something more powerful than professional duty. I was fighting for my life, my freedom, and the memory of every child who had suffered in Samuel's network. The run to Margaret Harrison's house felt like it took forever, but I made it without being spotted by the search teams that were undoubtedly combing the area for me. Her small blue house looked exactly as it had weeks ago when I'd first sought her help, but this time I approached with the desperate knowledge that she might be my last hope for justice. Margaret answered my frantic knocking immediately, as if she'd been waiting for me. Anna, thank God you're alive. We heard about Agent Harrison's death, and we've been terrified about what they might do to silence you. Agent Harrison's death. The words hit me like physical blows, confirming my worst fears about the scope of the corruption I was fighting. The man who had promised to save me, who had equipped me with recording devices and coordinated federal agents, had been murdered to protect Samuel's network. They killed him! I gasped, still trying to catch my breath from my desperate run. Car accident yesterday evening, just like your parents 8 years ago, Margaret replied grimly. James was driving to Cedar Ridge to coordinate your rescue when his vehicle went off Highway 36 during clear weather conditions. The local sheriff ruled it accidental, but we know better. She pulled me inside, quickly locking the door behind us. The corruption runs deeper than any of us realized, Anna. The federal agents who contacted you weren't really federal agents. They were part of Samuel's protection network, using official credentials to identify and eliminate threats to the operation. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Not only had Samuel fooled the entire town of Cedar Ridge, but he had corrupted federal agencies, created false identities for his associates, and eliminated anyone who threatened to expose his network. But there are still people fighting. Margaret continued leading me to her basement, where I was amazed to find a sophisticated communications center with radio equipment filing cabinets and maps marked with locations across multiple states. Your mother wasn't the only one gathering evidence, and James wasn't our only contact in law enforcement. The basement revealed the true scope of the resistance network my mother had been part of. Women who had survived trafficking honest law enforcement officers who couldn't be corrupted journalists and social workers who documented cases of missing children and suspicious activities. We've been building a case independently of the official authorities, Margaret explained as she operated the radio equipment. There are FBI agents in Washington who specialize in corruption cases who know that local field offices can't be trusted when investigating networks like Samuel's. Within minutes, she had established contact with what she assured me were genuine federal authorities agents, whose identities had been verified through multiple channels, who were part of an internal investigation into corruption within regional FBI offices. This is Agent Sarah Morrison, FBI Internal Affairs, Washington, D.C. A woman's voice came through the radio speaker. Anna Wheeler, we've been waiting for you to contact us. Your mother's evidence has been crucial to our investigation, but we needed confirmation that you were still alive and able to testify. A woman. After being betrayed by men who claimed to represent justice, hearing a female voice offering help felt like a blessing. Agent Morrison, they killed the real Agent Harrison. The people who contacted me were part of Samuel's network. We know. James Harrison was working with us to expose corruption in the Kansas field office. His murder confirms that we're dealing with a network that extends far beyond local criminals. This involves federal agents, state officials, and interstate trafficking operations that generate millions of dollars annually. Agent Morrison explained that Washington had been conducting its own investigation into Samuel's network for over a year, using evidence my mother had provided before her death and testimony from other survivors who had managed to escape or age out of the system. We have federal marshals positioned around Cedar Ridge, but we couldn't move openly because we weren't sure which local agents could be trusted. Your escape has actually helped us. Samuel's people are scrambling to contain the situation, making mistakes that will help us identify all the network participants. What about the fake agents at my house? What about Samuel? They're walking into a trap they don't realize we've set. Every person involved in today's operation is under surveillance by agents they don't know exist. We'll have them all in custody within hours. As if to confirm her words, we could hear sirens in the distance. Not the local sheriff's cars I was familiar with, but multiple vehicles moving with the coordinated precision of federal law enforcement conducting simultaneous arrests. Anna. Agent Morrison continued. We need you to stay hidden until we can secure the area. But I want you to know that your courage, your mother's evidence, and the network of survivor women have made it possible to expose corruption that extends across multiple states and involves dozens of officials we never could have identified otherwise. Through Margaret's basement window, I could see helicopters approaching Cedar Ridge from multiple directions, federal helicopters carrying agents who answered to Washington rather than local field offices that had been compromised by Samuel's network. The real cavalry was finally arriving. Justice was finally coming to Cedar Ridge, Kansas. But the most important realization was that I hadn't been fighting alone. My mother's courage had inspired a network of women who refused to let her sacrifice be in vain, who had continued her work, despite the risks, who had protected and preserved the evidence needed to bring down an empire of evil. As the sounds of arrests and federal operations filled the air outside Margaret Harrison's house, I touched my mother's silver locket and whispered a promise to her memory. The network that had destroyed our family was being dismantled, the corruption that had protected monsters was being exposed, and the children who had suffered in silence would finally see their tormentors brought to justice. Samuel Wheeler's reign of terror was ending, and I had survived to witness its destruction. The arrests that followed were swift, coordinated, and devastating to the network that had operated with impunity for decades. From Margaret Harrison's basement, I watched through her windows as federal agents swarmed our farmhouse, the sheriff's department, and locations throughout Cedar Ridge with military precision. Samuel Wheeler was taken into custody as he stood on our front porch, still wearing his best suit and carrying the briefcase full of documents he'd planned to use for my sale to the Henderson family. The expression on his face as federal marshals read him his rights was one of genuine shock. He had been so confident in his protection network that he couldn't comprehend how it had been penetrated and destroyed. Sheriff Morrison, the corrupt agents posing as federal authorities. Pastor Williams, Judge Henley, and 17 other community leaders were arrested simultaneously, their decades of complicity finally exposed by evidence they never knew existed. The scope of the corruption was staggering. It included bank presidents who laundered trafficking profits, school officials who helped identify vulnerable children, and state government employees who falsified documents to facilitate interstate transportation of minors. But the most satisfying arrest was that of the fake agents who had tried to institutionalize me. Agent Sarah Morrison later explained that these men had been using federal credentials stolen from deceased agents, operating with such confidence in their protection network that they never suspected they were being monitored by genuine federal authorities. The Henderson house in Topeka was raided simultaneously, revealing horrors that made national headlines. Federal agents discovered hidden rooms equipped with restraints and recording equipment files containing photographs and descriptions of hundreds of children who had passed through their training programs, and financial records showing transactions totaling millions of dollars over 2 decades. But most damning of all was the discovery of my father's complete business records in Samuel's private safe, detailed documentation of every child sold through the network, including purchase prices, buyer preferences, and feedback from customers who rated their merchandise like restaurant reviews. The trials that followed were covered by newspapers across the country, exposing how a trafficking network had operated under the protection of corrupt officials while hiding behind the facade of Christian respectability. Samuel Wheeler, facing overwhelming evidence, including the recordings I had made, was sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. The Henderson family received similar sentences, as did the corrupt FBI agents, local law enforcement officers, and government officials who had enabled their crimes. But more importantly, the trials revealed the existence of similar networks in other states, leading to investigations that ultimately dismantled trafficking operations across the entire Midwest. I testified at Samuel's trial, standing in a federal courthouse and telling the world exactly what he was. My voice never wavered as I described years of abuse, the systematic preparation for my sale to the Hendersons, and the network of corruption that had protected his crimes for decades. Samuel Wheeler sat in the defendant's chair during my testimony, no longer the respected community leader who had fooled Cedar Ridge for so long. In federal custody, wearing prison clothes and shackled like the dangerous criminal he had always been, he looked diminished, pathetic, stripped of the grandfatherly facade that had concealed his true nature. When I finished my testimony, when I had told the complete truth about his crimes and their impact on countless victims, Samuel looked directly at me for the first time since his arrest. There was no remorse in his expression, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, only the frustrated rage of a predator whose hunting ground had been destroyed. "You don't understand what you've done," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the courtroom despite the judge's orders for silence. "This network provided services that powerful people needed. Without it, they'll just create something worse, something you'll never be able to find or stop." His words were prophetic, in ways I wouldn't understand until years later. But in that moment, they only strengthened my resolve to continue the fight my mother had started. Evil would always exist. Predators would always seek new ways to exploit the vulnerable, but survivors would also continue to resist, to expose, to protect the innocent. The Henderson house was seized by federal authorities and converted into a safe house for trafficking survivors, a place where children could heal from their trauma while receiving the support and protection they needed to rebuild their lives. It seemed like perfect justice that a building designed for exploitation would become a sanctuary for those who had suffered. But the most important outcome wasn't the punishment of individual criminals, it was the exposure of how such networks operate, how they hide behind respectability and community standing, how they use corruption and intimidation to silence their victims. Margaret Harrison became my legal guardian after Samuel's arrest, and she helped me understand that healing wasn't just about moving past trauma, It was about transforming pain into purpose, using survival as a foundation for helping others who were still trapped in similar situations. July 15th, 1965. I'm 23 now, a graduate of the University of Kansas with degrees in journalism and criminal justice, working as an investigative reporter specializing in organized crime and corruption cases. My apartment in Kansas City is modest, but comfortable, decorated with photographs of my mother and the other survivor women who made my rescue possible. The most prominent item in my living room is a framed newspaper clipping from the trial that exposed Samuel's network, not because I'm proud of the media attention, but because it represents the moment when decades of silence were finally broken, when victims found their voices and used them to demand justice. Samuel Wheeler died in federal prison in 1962, 3 years into his life sentence. He never showed remorse for his crimes, never acknowledged the pain he had caused, but he also never again had the power to hurt children. His death was noted in a small obituary that described him as a Kansas farmer, without mentioning the empire of evil he had built and operated. The Henderson family remains in federal custody, serving concurrent life sentences in separate facilities. Their trafficking operation was completely dismantled, their assets seized, their network of buyers and sellers exposed and prosecuted. But more importantly, the survivors they had abused were provided with support counseling and opportunities to rebuild their lives. Margaret Harrison continues to coordinate support services for trafficking survivors using the network my mother helped establish to provide resources and advocacy for children who manage to escape or age out of similar operations. She's become a nationally recognized expert on organized child abuse, testifying before Congress about the need for federal legislation to protect vulnerable minors. I still have nightmares, sometimes still struggle with trust and intimacy, still carry the physical and emotional scars of my childhood trauma. Healing is an ongoing process rather than a destination, and I've learned to accept that some wounds never completely close. But I've also discovered that survival can be transformed into strength, that pain can be channeled into purpose, that the worst experiences of our lives can become the source of our greatest contributions to protecting others. My work as an investigative journalist has exposed 3 other trafficking networks operating in different regions, leading to arrests and convictions that have saved dozens of children from the fate I narrowly escaped. Each investigation is dangerous. Each story requires me to relive aspects of my own trauma, but each successful prosecution honors the memory of my mother and the other women who fought to make such justice possible. Last month, I received a letter from a young woman named Sarah Collins, the daughter of Marie Collins, one of my childhood friends, who had disappeared when we were both 7 years old. Sarah had been born into the network that purchased her mother, had grown up believing that sexual servitude was normal, but had eventually escaped and was now working to expose the buyers who had sustained Samuel's operation. Her letter reminded me that the battle against organized child abuse doesn't end with individual prosecutions. It requires ongoing vigilance, continued investigation, and the courage of survivors who refuse to let their experiences be dismissed or forgotten. This week marks the 10th anniversary of Samuel's arrest and the dismantling of his network. Tonight, Margaret and I will light candles for my mother and for all the children who didn't survive their encounters with predators like Samuel Wheeler. We'll remember their names, honor their memories, and renew our commitment to ensuring that their suffering was not meaningless. Tomorrow, I'll continue investigating reports of suspicious activities in rural Missouri, following leads that suggest another trafficking network may be operating under the protection of corrupt local officials. The pattern is depressingly familiar: respected community leaders, children who disappear without adequate investigation, law enforcement that seems more interested in protecting reputations than pursuing justice. But now I know how to recognize the signs, how to gather evidence safely, how to connect with federal authorities who can't be corrupted or intimidated. More importantly, I know that I'm not fighting alone. There's a network of survivors, advocates, and honest law enforcement officers who are committed to protecting children from the monsters who prey upon them. My mother's silver locket still hangs around my neck, warming my skin with the promise that the strength of generations flows through me. She died trying to save me from Samuel's network, but her courage, her evidence, and her connections to other survivor women ultimately made my rescue possible. This is my story, my testimony, my promise to every child who has ever felt trapped and powerless in the face of adult evil. You are not alone. You are not worthless. You are not responsible for what was done to you. The fight for justice is difficult, dangerous, and often heartbreaking. But with courage, careful planning, and allies who understand the true nature of evil, it is possible to expose monsters, dismantle their networks, and create a world where children are protected rather than exploited. Sometimes the good guys really do win. Sometimes justice really does prevail. Sometimes the monsters really do face consequences for their crimes. But only when survivors refuse to stay silent. Only when we transform our pain into power. Only when we refuse to let them win.